lecture guest speaker series, Theology and the Arts, whereby we invite artists and scholars to talk about the connections between the Christian faith and various art forms. Our first speaker is Dr. Ben Lima, who is going to speak to us about Christianity and the visual arts. He is an art historian and critic who studied art history at Harvard and got his PhD in art history at Yale. He has written for the Living Church and for Dallas Morning News. Please welcome to St. Barnabas, Dr. Ben Lima.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Father Lorenzo, for the invitation, and thank you all so much for having me. What difference does Christianity make for the visual arts? I would first like to suggest that one of the most fundamental, but often unacknowledged or often underappreciated aspects of the visual arts is namely that they are most powerful and most moving when understood within the context of a narrative. This is because narrative, or storytelling, is maybe the most fundamental, powerful, and universal human mode of storytelling, certainly more powerful than abstract logic or reasoning, and that therefore the visual arts depend on narrative for their power. When we see something, we ask, who or what is this? What is happening here? And why? And usually the most basic answer takes the form of a story. By far the most popular forms of visual media, namely movies, TV shows, and sports, all take the form of narrative. How will things turn out in the end? And I would insist that even in the case of other visual arts like painting and sculpture, the same basic issues govern their appeal. The tricky part, as we will see, is that this truth is often ignored. In fact, it's all too common for the visual arts today to ignore or neglect the importance of narrative, and as a result, for their appeal to the public to be sadly very limited. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, virtually all pre-modern art could tie into narrative this way, namely through myth. Classical art is populated by figures who would be known by their audience from their presence in absorbing and engaging myths. If you can identify the figures, you know the story behind them, and vice versa. On the left here is the Hindu deity Shiva Nataraja, who's known as the Lord of the Dance, or King of the Dance. In Hinduism, there's a dance of creation and a dance of destruction, and Shiva is surrounded by the cosmic fire which creates and destroys everything. So we're watching, on the left, the continuous creation and destruction of the universe. On the right is the Greek myth of Laocoon and his two sons, who are being strangled to death by serpents sent by the vengeful god Poseidon. The point being that since stories give a fundamental shape and order to the artwork, even without knowing the whole story, you can get a basic sense of what is going on. And once you know the story, it's extremely easy and intuitive to make sense of the visual work and to have the story and art mutually enrich each other. You don't need any special training or expertise to understand the story, and at the same time, you can appreciate the great sensitivity and insight of the artist in bringing the story to life. So throughout pre-modern and traditional cultures of all kinds, narrative or story motivates and gives shape to visual art and accounts for its role and power in society. But of course, in the modern world, stories don't disappear entirely. The modern world created its own narratives too. For example, the stories of nationalism or liberalism, in which the heroes, the protagonists of the story, might be, for example, the idea of liberty, as in the upper right, or a people or a nation, symbolized at the lower right. We can just note briefly that both the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address have narrative aspects. They say what has happened, why it's happened, and what it means for now and the future. And up through the 19th century, indeed, some of the greatest paintings tap into such narratives. For example, Emanuel Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware, or Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Just like orators, the artists here are still trying to speak to their audiences in order to inspire them, to bind them together as a group, and to motivate them in a certain direction, so that everyone who hears or sees these stories will be motivated to join together and participate in this story. But there's a problem. The kind of modern secular narratives that were supposed to inspire people and bind them together seem to have lost credibility. Many people would agree with the critic Walter Benjamin that every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarism. it's extremely easy to show that every act of heroism seems also to entail an act of oppression. And if you look at history from a certain angle, all of history really does appear to be filled with nothing but oppression, or at best, a never-ending struggle against oppression and the suspicion that each new regime will uncover or perhaps create a new form of oppression to replace the old one. So just for example, it's very easy to look at art history and think that it is almost nothing but the sexist, patriarchal objectification of women. And here, for example, are two critical contemporary artists, Barbara Kruger and the Guerrilla Girls, who are focused singularly on uncovering the sexism of art history, suggesting that the heroic stories told in traditional art history are really just nothing but toxic masculinity or patriarchal oppression. And here are two conceptual art pieces by Hans Haacke, who's one of the founders of that school. On the left, in 1970, he created a poll for visitors to the Museum of Modern Art, asking them whether they approved of the support of the Vietnam War by Nelson Rockefeller, who was a trustee of the museum. And on the right is a piece documenting the allegedly exploitative real estate practices of a real estate firm in Manhattan. So Haacke has basically devoted his career to showing how the great and good patrons of the art world are really exploitative and rapacious. Haacke would say that there is good reason to think that behind every form of institutional power, there is a form of oppression that needs to be unmasked. So thus, for many people today, it's very difficult to believe in the kind of inspiring narratives that we saw in 19th century painting. And unfortunately, but understandably, the first response of many people in seeing any kind of monument to a great person is to be suspicious of it. However, also unfortunately, purely critical narratives, despite their value, don't seem to be very capable of inspiring or moving people on a deep level. No one is really going to develop any kind of passionate attachment to a work by Hans Haacke, or to go back to see it again and again. In fact, you could argue that it doesn't even really need to be a work of art at all. It could just be a pamphlet or a lecture. You don't need to actually see it. So what kind of inspiring narratives are actually available in 2021 as the basis for art? The ancient myths seem very remote. The Marvel Cinematic Universe and the NFL are successful as entertainment, but can't really claim the cosmic significance of great art. The modern narratives, such as nationalism and liberalism, are easily shown to be guilty of one form of oppression or another. The critical narratives of conceptual art, such as Hans Haacke or the Guerrilla Girls, take the form of a single protagonist, namely the artist, triumphantly exposing and unmasking oppression and revealing the truth. But this kind of narrative, I think, really only appeals to a very small number of people, including many museum curators, but not so much to the general public. So I think this leaves one more kind of narrative that actually predominates among a great deal of modern art, and that is of the lone individual who is, as Walker Percy would say, lost in the cosmos, the artist or viewer. I think that enormous amounts of modern art start from this kind of existentialist premise, whether in Jackson Pollock's action painting at the upper right or Nam June Paik's video art at the lower right. The premise that the artist and the viewer are purely undetermined individuals, driven by nothing but their own willpower, their own impulses and desires, which are not ordered by or governed by anything external to themselves, or indeed by anything objective in the cosmos at all. But in this kind of narrative, the individual is terribly disconnected and unrooted. There's no larger structure or story or community that shapes or guides the journey of the lone individual in a way that connects them to something greater. It's just the artist in their studio, the artist exploring whatever surrounds them, according to whatever whim or chance event happens to flit across their consciousness at that moment. And this, of course, is the predicament of modern people in general, as brilliantly explored by Walker Percy in his novels. So ultimately, I think that this kind of art, the art of pure individualism, is also not that appealing to the public at large. Ultimately, many viewers will ask, why do I care whether the artist does this or that? Why do I care whether the artist puts the viewer in this or that position? Is it just what they happen to feel like doing? What if I don't happen to like it? Isn't it all just a matter of personal preference? Is every individual simply doomed to wander around doing whatever he or she may happen to prefer at any moment, with no guarantee that it will make any sense or any difference to anyone else? So, of course, I would argue that Christianity is the meta-narrative or grand narrative that solves these problems. Because of the Christian doctrines of original sin and atonement, Christianity can acknowledge the suffering of the victims of history, as today's dominant critical narratives rightly insist that we do. But unlike the critical narratives, Christianity offers a hope of redemption and new creation, that history is not just one form of oppression after another, that there is hope for something better. Like the narratives of the pre-modern myths and the narratives of modern ideologies, Christianity is capable of binding people together and inspiring them to participate in a greater story. But unlike the pre-modern and modern narratives, Christianity, because of the doctrines of creation, fall, redemption, and new creation, can offer hope to those who find themselves on the outside of those narratives, the marginalized, excluded, etc. It would be hard for Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling to be considered as great as it is if it didn't happen to tell the greatest story of all, the creation of the universe in Genesis. And here are just a few details. It's the whole ceiling is much larger, showing the separation of light from dark, the creation of Adam and Eve. But ultimately, all of Christian art plugs into that same story at one point or another. And just to underline the point, all of Christian art is animated by the hope expressed in the New Testament, that all things have been created through Christ and for Christ, as in Colossians, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay, as in Romans, that Christ is making all things new. So all things, one way or another, fit somehow into the Christian story. Even the capitalist exploitation and patriarchal oppression so rightly denounced by critical artists can be brought into the story somehow. All things. That's why we call it a grand narrative. But how exactly is this expressed in the arts? This leads to my second point, which is that the kind of story one tells implies something about the world, that is, the universe or the cosmos that one lives in. Fundamentally, Christianity affirms and extends the view of Pythagoras and of Plato, that every level of reality, from mathematics and the fundamental laws of physics, through the beauty of music, and even, especially, the consciousness of human beings, has an order and a harmony, a logos, because it was created through divine wisdom, and that we can know and discover and enjoy this order because we also were created through the same divine wisdom. As Plato said, rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul. Or as Jacques Maritain wrote, beauty is the splendor of the form on the proportioned parts of matter. That is to say, it is a flashing of intelligence on a matter intelligibly arranged. This fundamental harmony between the material universe on the one hand and the mind, heart, and soul on the other hand, mediated through relationships or ratios of order, proportion, and harmony, is often called classicism or Platonism. And this, by the way, is from the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the great Celtic manuscripts produced by monks on the most remote island in Europe. And if one recognizes and acknowledges this harmony, what the Pythagoreans called the music of the spheres, the natural response is a kind of wonder, as seen in this wonderful painting by Giovanni Bellini, St. Francis in Ecstasy. There's a joy in discovering the seemingly limitless beauty of the creation and its intelligibility to us. But what happens if this system falls apart? What happens if we start to lose confidence that there ultimately is any fundamental order to things? And especially, what happens if we start to doubt that there is any fundamental order to the moral, aesthetic, and human dimension of reality? That instead of originating in the mind of God, all the apparent order and beauty of the universe is really just a matter of blind chance, with no inherent meaning, purpose, or significance beyond what we wishfully project onto it, which lasts just for a few moments before we all permanently vanish into nothingness. There are some very vivid and colorful ways of putting this predicament. For example, Carl Becker's statement that humanity is little more than a chance deposit on the surface of the world, carelessly thrown up between two ice ages by the same forces that rust iron and ripen corn. If this is how things are, the result is that it becomes the job of the artist to grimly but fearlessly expose the hollowness and falseness of the ideas of order and beauty, and in artworks like those here by Robert Morris and Linda Benglis, to reveal that behind all of our wishful imaginative projections, there is really just nothing but mute, meaningless, formless matter. As Iredell Jenkins describes what he calls the postulate of an impoverished reality, that is, quote, the settled conviction that nature is, in fact, much simpler and barer than it appears to us in experience, end quote, which I think is kind of the fundamental fear and doubt of modern life. It suggests that the universe is really, deep down, just noise, like this, that in a blink of an eye, human beings will be gone, and this is all that will be left, that deep down, reality is just an endless stream of static. And just to quote a couple more summaries of this situation, in Bertrand Russell's words, he says, quote, humanity's origin, growth, hopes, fears, loves, and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, end quote. Or that, as C.S. Lewis says, what if all the beauties of one's beloved are but, quote, a momentary and accidental pattern produced by the collision of atoms, and that your own response to them is only a sort of psychic phosphorescence arising from the behavior of your genes, end quote. So again, I believe that the ugliness, the shapelessness, the meaninglessness of so much modern art reflects this deep conviction that reality really is impoverished, that behind all of our hopes and fears, there is nothing but static. It would hardly be possible to draw a greater contrast than that between formless, shapeless modern art and the characteristic art of the most thoroughly, explicitly Christian civilization in history, the Gothic cathedrals of the High Middle Ages. Gothic architecture is the result of the conviction that every facet of reality, from largest to smallest, from highest to lowest, has its part to play in glorifying its creator, and that the cosmic order at the largest scale harmonizes with the same order at the smallest scale, and that everything is illuminated by the physical light, which is an analogy of the divine light. Abbot Suger, who was one of the first inventors of the Gothic in the 12th century, said, when he experienced the beauty of this architecture, quote, it seems to me that I see myself dwelling, as it were, in some strange region of the universe, which neither exists entirely in the slime of the earth, nor entirely in the purity of heaven, end quote. According to the theologian Pseudo-Dionysius, the light is from the good, and an image of the goodness, wherefore the good also is celebrated under the name of light. Just a couple of examples, rhymes or round cathedral, and showing, taken from a few others, what the Gothic sense of order looks like. The flying buttress, the rose window, the vaulted ceilings, and the pointed arches with the tympanum. That at any small scale, you see the same harmony as in the totality. And the total effect of this is so powerful that even countless people who have no religious belief whatsoever were deeply saddened when Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris caught fire in 2019. As one writer said for NBC News, quote, like many devout atheists, I've always had a thing for churches, end quote. Enormous numbers of people can appreciate the beauty of Gothic architecture without sharing any religious convictions at all with its architects. But the question that atheists ultimately have to answer is, how could it be possible for the architects of the Gothic to create something so universally recognized as beautiful if they were so fundamentally wrong about the nature of reality? And why, if the modern world is actually correct about the nature of reality, does it produce so many ugly buildings? But what, if anything, the careful listener may ask, is specifically Christian about all this? It's certainly not the case that Christianity has any kind of monopoly on understanding the world through a grand narrative or an ordered cosmos. By no means. Rather, the preceding discussion is meant to contrast Christianity with the kind of impersonal, disenchanted modern or postmodern worldview that rejects any overarching narrative or order, that rejects God, in other words. But of course, the other religions of the world, like Christianity, but unlike modern secularism, all do recognize, as did the ancient Greek pre-Christian philosophers, that the world is made by God and possesses an inherent order. And it's not only about art and aesthetics. I have to mention the appendix to C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, which is entitled Illustrations of the Tao, or the Tao, I guess. where Lewis collects citations from various cultural traditions around the world, Arabic and Chinese and Indian, to show the widespread, even universal agreement on fundamental moral principles like love their neighbor. So that's kind of the moral parallel to what I'm saying about aesthetics. As Romans says, ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. And as Psalm 19 says, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And again, the traditional religious pre-modern art of the whole world does reflect this beauty and order through common grace or general revelation known to all peoples. Here we can see, for example, that ancient temples, whether Roman, Japanese, or Indian, all show this kind of order and beauty in their design and construction. Within the Christian tradition specifically, we can see this very well in the case of landscape painting. For example, the work of Thomas Cole, member of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Catskill, New York, the great American landscape painter and the founder of the Hudson River School of Painting, seeing that the wonder and beauty of the landscape is itself a testimony to the glory of God. Or that, as Paul said to his pagan audience at Lystra in Acts chapter 14, that even though they did not know the God of the Bible, that God did not leave himself without a witness in doing good, giving them rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, and that they knew that this was from God. In biblical, that is, Jewish and Christian terms, the goodness of creation means that far from turning away and rejecting the material world as irredeemably corrupt, we know that the material world was made to be good, as is stated 7 consecutive times in Genesis chapter 1. Good, 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 good. And that it is good for us to participate in it, as described in chapter 35 of Exodus, when Moses tells the Israelites to bring their offerings into the tent of meeting. Moses says, "All who are skillful among you shall come and make all that the Lord has commanded." And in response, all the skillful women spun with their hands and brought what they had spun in blue and purple and crimson yarns and fine linen. All the women whose hearts moved them to use their skill spun the goat's hair. We can see this reflected in the tradition of genre painting. For example, here in Vermeer's Lace Maker, that the act of making is good and participates in the beauty of creation. Okay, so what, if anything, does Christianity not share with the rest of the world's religions? And here, I say that some ideas which are very familiar as a matter of doctrine have an impact on art and aesthetics that is not perhaps well enough recognized. Of course, we have to start with the crucifixion, which will always be a horrific, shocking, disturbing, gruesome event, even if Christians are always in danger of forgetting that it is so. Crucifixion was horrific in the Roman Empire and is still horrific today. And that means that a Christian concept of beauty can never be simply equated with or reduced to a classical or pagan concept of beauty. As emphasized by the theologian Jeremy Begbie, in Jesus Christ, quote, "Divine beauty has, so to speak, come to grips with the wounded and deformed beauty of the world. In the incarnate Son, crucified, risen, and now exalted, we witness God's recreation of the world's beauty," end quote. For Christianity, the fact that the perfect human being should have undergone the most horrible death permanently relativizes the classical concept of beauty in the light of divine love. That in the words of Isaiah, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him, or that according to Philippians, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, and humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, means that beauty, for Christians, is something more than just the physical perfection of a Greek Apollo, or the fitness for purpose predicted by evolutionary psychology or consumeristic desire. It means that divine beauty has reached down into the darkest, most painful places in the cosmos and offered those suffering there a way out of despair. That unlike the strictly heroic or critical narratives of modernity, it both recognizes the suffering of the victims of history and promises a way out of permanent victimhood. And the knowledge that Christ is the most fundamental principle of reality affects everything else, including one's entire vision of society. In the most profoundly Christian artists, like Rembrandt, as in his painting of the return of the prodigal son, he shows a social vision that is centered on Christ, not simply celebrating the greatest and grandest members of society, the most beautiful, magnificent, impressive people, a la classical art, but the lost and the suffering. As Psalm 113 says, God raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap and seats them among princes. Or that, as Paul says to the Corinthians and to us, not many of you were wise by human standards, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. It also means that everyone, even the most humble and ordinary of us, has a noble part to play within the grand narrative and thus is worthy of respect. And my favorite example, cited by N.T. Wright, is the story of Tabitha, or Dorcas, in the New Testament, who was healed by Peter. This drawing of Tabitha from the 17th century. Tabitha, who was devoted to good works and acts of charity, spent her time making tunics and other clothing, a humble, anonymous, but essential role. The point being that for most of us, our role in the kingdom of God is much more like that of Tabitha than like Peter's or Paul's, but we're all part of the same body. And that means, in terms of art, that even the most humble and ordinary people are an essential part of the story, and that poets and painters should tell their stories too. And of course, ultimately this can happen because the resurrection and ascension mean that since Christ is seated on the throne of glory, he has the power and authority to rule the new creation with justice and peace. That, as Frodo says to Gandalf in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, everything sad will come untrue. That the victims of history, no matter how awful their fate, won't be victims forever. In C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, when the narrator sees a beautiful grand procession in heaven with spirits scattering flowers, boys and girls singing in honor of a great lady whose beauty makes her almost unbearable to look at, the narrator asks his guide who it is, and he's told, oh, it's someone you'll never have heard of. Her name on earth was Sarah Smith, and she lived at Golders Green. Because fame on heaven and fame on earth are two quite different things, this poor anonymous woman, through her love, is elevated to heaven in glory. 1,000 liveried angels lackey her because she loved every boy and girl she met like her own son or daughter. She even loved every animal she met. Lewis writes, already there is joy enough in the little finger of a great saint such as yonder lady to waken all the dead things of the universe into life. The resurrection and ascension of Christ mean that there has been a redefinition of power, so that ultimately the saints like the anonymous woman from Golders Green will be elevated to the place of honor that is their due. As Lewis writes in The Weight of Glory, there are no ordinary people. You have never met a mere mortal. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would strongly be tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or another of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. That is the vision that animates Christian art, that any humble Tabitha or prodigal son may one day be raised to unimaginable glory, and that every day and every moment is charged with unimaginable significance. This sense of the sacred is what made the Gothic cathedrals so beautiful, as they encompass the highest and lowest aspects of the cosmos. And that is what motivates the beauty of Christian art to this day. Finally, I would like to make a couple of suggestions for more things to read on these topics. The Visual Commentary on Scripture, which is online at thevcs.org, is a wonderful way to explore how certain artists have interpreted particular passages of Scripture. The authors include theologians, biblical scholars, art historians, and others. Second, James Matthew Wilson's book entitled The Vision of the Soul, Truth, Goodness, and Beauty in the Western Tradition is an excellent way of thinking about the importance of beauty in particular and why the arts in general really only make sense and have value in terms of the beauty of creation. Third, David Lyle Jeffrey's book, In the Beauty of Holiness, Art and the Bible in Western Culture, explores the relationship between those two terms, beauty and holiness, and how different approaches to Christian art have resolved the tension between those two in different ways. And fourth, Todd Hartch's book, A Time to Build Anew, How to Find the Good, True, and Beautiful in America, is an excellent set of case studies of artists, architects, and others who are successfully pursuing these goals at the present time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lima. And now we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A. So any questions you have, raise your hand and we'll ask them.
If the post-signs are right, that post-signs are right, that there is no reality and everything is basically chaos and meaningless, wouldn't that be the end of art?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that deep down there's this, in a lot of, I mean, I think when you walk into an art gallery and see something that is just ugly and I think that oftentimes deep down there's this tension. I mean, people feel like I need to keep doing something. I can't quite face that, that I can't quite, I mean, to face the implications of that is, I mean, the existentialists would say like that, I mean, does it lead to just suicide? Do you just not leave your room? I mean, that's a hard thing to face squarely, and so people have different ways of coping with it. And I think that that a lot of what we see is ultimately people trying to cope with it in some way that avoids facing that head on. I mean, that's my theory. But yes, I mean, it's the end of, it is the end of the beauty and joy and wonder in art, I think. Tough question, but a good question, yeah.
Do you see any modern artists, contemporary? I know that there's probably a fine difference between that I don't appreciate.
Yeah, yeah.
But who in fact do sort of pursue narrative?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In a more spiritual or religious sense?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the interesting thing is that this is the question. I'll repeat the question: that contemporary artists active now who do engage with narrative and spirituality and so forth, and I think the key fact is that out of the thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people who make art, there's a tiny fraction who are kind of institutionally elevated, that you see in a museum or that have awards and prizes and so forth. And so when people talk about contemporary art, they usually mean that small fraction who have been rewarded and kind of deemed to be valued by our institutions. And so I think there are many contemporary artists in the broader sense who are deeply devoted to beauty and to spirituality and so forth, who might not you might not see them in a museum. So there are many. In the 20th century, it's not active right now, but Georges Rouault here on the left of early 20th century French artist is often the starting point when you're talking about modern art. And Marc Chagall, who was not Christian but Jewish, although deeply interested in Jesus, and he painted crucifixions. Marc Chagall, Georges Rouault are both key in the 20th century. Well, I don't want to embarrass her, but there's an artist in Dallas named Pamela Nelson. I don't know if she'll see this. Pamela Nelson is an artist who makes wonderful art. There's Daniel Mitsui makes drawings and kind of print all kinds of narratives and illustrations. I think Daniel Mitsui's work is wonderful. I mean, there are many. The trickiest thing is that it's hard to know. You have to kind of find them or know where they are because you won't necessarily see them if you walk into a museum. You have to know what you're looking for, and oftentimes you have to get past a lot of kind of depressing stuff before you get there. But there's if you're interested, you can find it. So, yeah. Yes.
First, this was outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you wouldn't mind if I could take a picture of the last slides, I can get those.
Right.
chaplain of the university that I think is a human, I'm not sure, but humanistic atheist. So my question is, how do you make sense of the atheist who looks at Notre Dame and says and has an emotional reaction to this
Yeah.
and how they're reconciling themselves
Yeah.
to the world?
I mean, I feel like, well, I shouldn't try to speak for other people, but I think that by default that most atheists or agnostics would say, well, yeah, they're look what human. I think that's where we get caught in this cycle, because when you look at Notre Dame, or when you look at the great things that human beings have done, an atheist can say, wow, look, like, people are amazing. Look what human beings can do. Like, human beings are fantastic. But then when you start to go down that road, then it opens the door for the kind of critiques that say, well, look, but you're oppressing women, or you're oppressing other races, and so like the kind of 19th century stories, like there are plenty of people, I think even today, who celebrate kind of the story of liberty, for example. You don't have to believe in God to celebrate liberty, or to celebrate the story of our people, our nation, whatever that may be. And those, I think, are still today the live substitutes for religion. But again, the more you try to elevate the heroes of these stories, again, I just think it always opens the door for people to say, well, but like, aren't they all just hypocrites? And so I don't. But you asked about Notre Dame. I mean, I think it would be seen as just a story of great artistic genius and artistic talent, and that's the kind of a story that goes through Romanticism. This idea that, wow, art is powerful, art is amazing, artists are kind of special people, and therefore, like, Gothic cathedrals, Michelangelo. Like, you have this high point of great artistic heroes, but then like, that gets you to the fact that they were mostly men and sexist. So it's that kind of back and forth, I think, is the way it goes. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I enjoyed the talk, and I was tracking with you when you were talking about different artistic languages.
Yeah.
And narrative, and do we need a piece of art that can really just be a pamphlet? I was with you on all of that, and now I'm going to apologize for asking a deeply Calvinist question, Calvinist, and can't get away from it. Why the turn by you and the authors of the books on your last slide from talking about specific artistic languages to saying the thing we need to be talking about is beauty, truth, goodness? What about fallenness, brokenness, lamentation?
Yeah.
Isn't there a place for that? And why are we in danger of only recovering some of the narratives that need to be recovered and not all of them, if the punchline of this sort of recovery work is beauty, truth, and goodness, and not the rest of the things we see in the world?
No, thank you. Fantastic question, which I'll repeat. A kind of Calvinist question, which is why elevate beauty to the exclusion of lamentation, etc. And I will say that I think that is a question that's very much engaged in the literature, and in fact, I'm affirming the importance of the question. Jeremy Begbie, whom I quoted, is also in the Reformed tradition, and he, that little quote that I had about how beauty is transformed in Christianity is a small fraction of his larger work to basically ask that same question and challenge the same things. That he, Begbie, who's a scholar of music, a theologian of music, insists that it's wrong to simply take classical beauty and say, well, that's what beauty is. That the acknowledgement, the Christian acknowledgement of the suffering of Christ and so forth means that we can't just equate classical beauty and Christian beauty. And in fact, David Lyle Jeffrey from Baylor, who's also Protestant, I'm not sure what kind of Protestant, is also very critical of the moments, especially in the Renaissance, when Christian artists sort of got too enthusiastic about the classical tradition and just elevated pure kind of sensual beauty and really lost sight of holiness. So I think Jeffrey's book is a fantastic way of like engaging with that very tension. I think all I could say is that in talking about the suffering servant and the crucifixion, I absolutely acknowledge the importance of that, and I think the only answer I have is that that the beauty of a crucified, dead Jesus hanging on the cross is clearly not the same thing. I mean, maybe beauty isn't the right word for that. I'm open to that. But I totally agree, in other words, that we can't just say the beauty of classical sculpture is the same thing as Christian beauty. So it's a profoundly important question.
Thank you, Dr. Lima.
You go.
You got one more?
Oh.
Well, I was just going to say thank you. I don't pretend to know a lot about visual arts. I made my living in classical music before, to this day. But I know that I've been so moved by art that makes me think of something greater than self. 40 years ago, I spent 2 months in Britain and I went on a tour. I called it my cathedral tour. I went to every medieval cathedral in the country that I could get to.
Wow.
Over 8 weeks, just because somehow the grandeur and the expression of earth toward heaven was incredibly moving. It made me think about something greater than self. And this is totally disjointed, so I apologize. But another thing that I thought about when you were speaking was about 10 years ago when I lived in Connecticut, my parish there participated in a kind of a tour of a sculpture that was a figure of Christ, covered head down, covered in a blanket, looked like a homeless person, with a hand extended, but in the hand was the nail, the mark of the crucifixion, the nail in the hand.
Yeah.
And I promise you, the weirdest thing, there were people calling the police saying, "Why is this homeless guy sitting in front of St. Stephen's Church?"
Wow, yeah.
It was arresting.
Yeah.
It was striking. It was thought-provoking in the sort of what's going on, people didn't know how to respond to that. But that visceral response of a work of art that caused people to think about things spiritual was amazing.
Yeah.
And I was so glad that my parish participated in that tour. This statue was moved over the course of about 2 months to 6 or 8 different towns. And the same reaction happened everywhere. In Fairfield County, Connecticut. It was incredible.
Wow.
So I don't know what any of that means. I just thought it was something.
I think, that following up Angela's question, that the tradition, I think one of the most vital traditions in contemporary Christian art often involves, rejecting the kind of royal, kingly, imperial heritage of kind of the world, and saying, well, God isn't just like the emperor or the king on the throne. I mean, he is, but the kind of art that goes fully into the incarnation and the passion and the humble and the lowly, and says, no, this isn't, despite the beauty that it shares with the kind of traditions of the world, that this is really something about Christianity that is not familiar to being just another kind of temple or just another kind of king or queen. So that's a wonderful story. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Dr.
Oh, thank you.